There is a tuning fork in a museum in Bologna. Archive item number 4318, darkened steel. The craftsman's name is gone, worn away by time or removed by hand. No way to know which. What remains is a date, 1884, and a number etched into the metal, 432 Hertz. Press it against a wooden surface and listen. Musicians and acousticians who have heard it describe the sound the same way, independently, without prompting. Full, warm, physical. The kind of vibration you register in the chest before the ear has properly processed it. Not a sound you hear so much as a sound you feel. Now pick up a modern tuning fork. The one sitting in every music school, every conservatory, every instrument shop on earth. Strike it against the same surface. 440 Hertz. 8 Hertz of difference, less than a tenth of a semitone. An interval so small the human ear cannot reliably detect it in isolation, without direct comparison. So here is the question nobody wants to ask out loud. If the difference is so small it is almost imperceptible, why did someone spend 30 years fighting to make the entire world change? Why did that fight end in an international conference, a ratified ISO standard, the physical modification of centuries-old instruments, and the systematic replacement of every tuning fork in every professional music institution on Earth? 8 Hertz doesn't do that on its own. Something else does. Think about that for a second. For most of recorded human history, pitch was not a universal number. It was a local one, a negotiated one. The note A meant something different in Venice than it did in Paris, something different in Paris than it did in Leipzig. Court orchestras tuned to what suited their hall, cathedral choirs tuned to what suited their architecture, chamber ensembles tuned to what suited the range of the voices and the capabilities of the instruments in use. This gets characterized in standard histories of music as a problem, disorder, inconvenient variation that the rational 20th century finally corrected. But that framing omits something important. The variation was not random. It was not the result of ignorance or carelessness. Different institutions tuned to different pitches for reasons that were, in most cases, deliberate and considered. The acoustic properties of a specific building, the resonance characteristics of specific materials, the physical reality of specific bodies in specific spaces. The absence of a universal standard didn't produce chaos. It produced 1,000 forms of local coherence, each one adapted to something real. Walk into Chartres Cathedral. Built in the 12th century, researchers who have studied its acoustic properties have documented something that is difficult to attribute to accident. Specific frequency ranges are amplified and sustained throughout the building in ways that are consistent, measurable, and structurally non-random. The stone geometry behaves like an instrument. It has preferences, and the frequency ranges it favors, the pitches it amplifies and holds, fall precisely within the standards used during the centuries in which it was built and used. The same pattern appears in the Pantheon in Rome, in Romanesque basilicas across southern France, in pre-Christian stone structures whose builders left no written record of their intentions. Across different cultures, different centuries, different materials, the same underlying principle recurs. Enclosed spaces built with care tend to amplify specific frequency ranges, and the people who built them appear to have known this and worked with it. Whether they understood it in theoretical terms is a separate question. The practical knowledge was there. It was encoded in the dimensions of the rooms, the curvature of the vaults, the placement of the openings. You don't need an equation to know that a space sounds right. You need centuries of accumulated craft. That craft was not preserved in any document. It was preserved in the buildings themselves, and in the instruments built to play inside them. In the 1960s, a Swiss physician and researcher named Hans Jenny developed what he called cymatics, the systematic study of making sound visible. The method was straightforward. Place granular or liquid media on a vibrating surface, introduce a specific frequency, and observe what happens. What Jenny found, and documented with enough methodological care to make his work replicable, was that sound organizes matter. Different frequencies produce different forms. Some frequencies generate patterns of striking geometric regularity, concentric rings, radial symmetry, structures that resemble the cross-sections of natural objects, crystals, cellular membranes, the growth patterns of plants. Other frequencies produce irregular, unstable, or chaotic arrangements. Jenny was careful about his conclusions. He did not claim that 432 Hz was uniquely sacred or that 440 Hz was uniquely destructive. His research described a general phenomenon: frequency shapes form. The specific comparison between the two concert pitch standards was not the subject of his work, but the phenomenon itself matters. Because what Jenny demonstrated, rigorously and reproducibly, is that the number is not arbitrary. Different frequencies do different things to physical matter. The choice of a frequency, any frequency for any purpose, is not a neutral decision. It has consequences that extend beyond the aesthetic. Antonio Stradivari never read Jenny's work. He died in 1737. But the instruments he built in Cremona, working without laboratory equipment, without acoustic theory in any modern sense, guided entirely by accumulated practice and material intuition, remain 3 centuries later the most acoustically remarkable stringed instruments ever produced. Scientists have spent decades attempting to reverse engineer them. They have proposed explanations involving wood density, varnish chemistry, plate geometry, and the specific climatic conditions of the Little Ice Age. None of these explanations has achieved consensus. The instruments continue to produce results that modern manufacturing cannot replicate. Whatever Stradivari understood about the relationship between materials, form, and frequency, he understood it deeply enough to encode it in objects that have outlasted every theoretical framework developed to explain them. The Tibetan singing bowls represent a different tradition entirely, separated from Cremonese instrument making by geography, culture, and purpose. Hand-hammered across generations, used in monastic contexts not as musical instruments, but as tools for inducing specific physiological and attentional states. Clinical research on the effects of sustained low-frequency vibration, including but not limited to singing bowls, has produced measurable results. Changes in heart rate variability, cortisol levels, EEG patterns, self-reported pain and anxiety. The evidence base is growing. The mechanisms are not fully understood, but the effect is real enough to be investigated in hospital settings. 3 traditions, 3 continents, 3 centuries. None of them using the language of modern acoustics, all of them arriving at the same practical conclusion. The specific frequency of a sound is a variable with consequences worth attending to, not a backdrop, not a neutral container for melody and rhythm, a parameter that matters. That understanding, distributed, uncodified, embedded in stone and wood and hammered metal across the world, was the acoustic inheritance of the era before standardization. Then someone decided to replace it with a number that worked better for radio microphones. London, May 1939. A conference room, suits, proceedings. The formal international ratification of 440 Hz as the universal standard for concert pitch, the decision that would eventually become ISO 16, the document that governs the tuning of every instrument manufactured in the modern world. 4 months later, Germany invaded Poland. The deadliest war in human history had begun. Consider what that sequence meant in practical terms. The institutions that might have contested the new standard, conservatories, professional musicians' associations, the networks of instrument makers and acoustic craftsmen who maintained living knowledge of the previous traditions, were within months either conscripted, bombed, displaced, or consumed entirely by the emergency of survival. The infrastructure for organized cultural resistance to a bureaucratic decision simply ceased to exist across most of Europe for the next 6 years. Whether the timing was deliberate is a question the official historical record does not answer. What the record does establish is that the conditions created by the timing were extraordinarily favorable to the permanent adoption of the new standard without meaningful opposition. And the lobbying that produced that standard did not begin in 1939. It began in 1910. John Calhoun Deegan, American instrument manufacturer, based in Chicago. By 1910, he was already running an active campaign for 440 Hz standardization, writing to music associations, corresponding with standards bodies, funding initiatives, building coalitions across the United States and Europe. His interest was not acoustic, it was commercial, and it was direct. A single global tuning standard would eliminate the complexity and cost of manufacturing instruments to different regional specifications. It would create a unified international market. One number, one product line, one set of tolerances for every instrument sold to every music school on every continent. Deegan pushed this agenda for nearly 3 decades before the London Conference gave it the force of international law. He was not alone. Similar commercial pressures were visible throughout the late 19th century in the overlapping interests of industrial instrument manufacturers, early broadcast engineers, and the emerging recording industry. The economic logic of standardization was clear long before 1939. The London Conference did not create this momentum, it concluded it. This is the part that the official explanation, the story about radio broadcasting and practical convenience, quietly omits. The people most actively promoting 440 Hz had concrete financial interests in its adoption. That does not make their arguments wrong. It does mean that the standard history of a neutral technical improvement made for the benefit of musicians is incomplete in ways that matter. What followed the conference was not a debate, it was a replacement. The old church organs went first. Instruments built over centuries, their pipes cut and voiced to specific acoustic environments, tuned to specific pitch standards that had been in continuous use since their installation. To bring them into compliance with the new standard required physically shortening the pipes. This is not a reversible process. An organ pipe cut shorter is cut shorter permanently. Organs in Germany, France, England, and Italy underwent this modification. The instruments that came out the other side were not the instruments that went in. The tuning forks were replaced. The old ones, calibrated to 432 Hz, 435 Hz, and the various regional standards that had been in use across Europe, were discarded. New ones were manufactured to the new specification and distributed through conservatories, music schools, and professional associations. The physical objects that had carried the previous standard disappeared from circulation within a single professional generation. The craftsmen who had made them retired. Their apprentices learned the new number. The knowledge embedded in the old objects was not transferred. It was superseded. The orchestras were brought into compliance through the combined pressure of recording contracts, broadcast requirements, and the expectations of instrument manufacturers who were already building to the new standard. This rarely required explicit coercion. The new infrastructure simply made the old pitch incompatible with professional work. You could tune to 432 Hz if you chose. You would not be recorded. You would not be broadcast. You would not be hired. The choice, in practice, was not a choice. By 1953, when ISO 16 was formally ratified, the transformation was complete. A pitch tradition that had been maintained across Europe for centuries, embedded in the acoustic design of its architecture, encoded in its instruments, carried in the practical knowledge of its craftsmen, had been replaced in the space of approximately 1 decade. Not through argument, not through any process of cultural deliberation, through the combination of a commercial campaign 3 decades in the making, a bureaucratic conference, and a world war that eliminated the practical capacity for resistance at precisely the moment the standard was being locked in place. Now here is the part that should genuinely concern you, not as conspiracy, as a straightforward question of public knowledge. Sound affects the body. This is not alternative medicine, it is established physiology. Vibration influences heart rate, cortisol levels, neural oscillation, blood pressure, attentional states. The clinical use of sound for therapeutic purposes is an active and growing field of research. The mechanisms are not fully understood, but the effects are measurable and reproducible. Nobody serious disputes this. The global acoustic environment has been calibrated to 440 Hz for 80 years. Every piece of commercially recorded music, every streaming platform, every notification sound, every ringtone, every advertising jingle, every ambient soundtrack in every retail space on Earth. The totality of the sonic environment that modern humans inhabit from birth to death vibrates at or around this standard. The cumulative physiological effect of this saturation, of living inside one frequency standard for an entire lifetime, has not been studied. Not in any comprehensive way. Not in any peer-reviewed context that this investigation has been able to locate. The question of whether a different universal standard would produce measurably different effects on human stress levels, attentional capacity, or neurological baseline has, as far as the available record shows, never been formally posed in a scientific setting. This is a strange absence. We study the effects of urban noise on sleep. We study the effects of light frequency on circadian rhythm. We study the effects of specific soundscapes on productivity and stress. The idea that frequency affects biology is not controversial. The specific question of what the universal standardization of musical pitch does to the people living inside it has simply never been asked. Why that question has not been asked is itself a question worth sitting with. The pre-modern traditions described earlier, the acoustic architecture of the cathedrals, the physiological effects of the singing bowls, the unreplicable resonance of the Stradivarius instruments, do not constitute proof of anything. They are fragments, evidence of a practical understanding, distributed across cultures and centuries, that the frequency of sound has consequences worth attending to. Evidence that the people who built and used these objects knew this, in their own terms, well enough to act on it. Whether the architects of the modern standard knew it too is a question the record does not answer directly. What the record shows is that they were not musicians or acousticians acting primarily in the interest of music. They were manufacturers and commercial lobbyists acting in the interest of market unification. The question of what sound does to the bodies of the people who listen to it was not, as far as the available documentation suggests, a significant part of their deliberations. That may be entirely innocent. Standardization is a blunt instrument. It optimizes for compatibility and scale, not for the subtler properties of the thing being standardized. The people who decided that the world should tune to 440 Hz were probably not thinking about cathedrals or singing bowls or the acoustic craft embedded in centuries of instrument making. They were thinking about manufacturing tolerances and broadcast compatibility. Whether those are adequate reasons to replace a centuries-old acoustic inheritance during a catastrophe without consultation permanently is a judgment the official record declines to make. The Bologna tuning fork is still in its drawer, archive item 4318, dated 1884, calibrated to 432 Hz, a physical record of a standard that was maintained deliberately across generations for reasons that were practical and considered and connected to something real about the relationship between sound and the spaces and bodies it moves through. The decision to abandon it was made by people with commercial interests in its abandonment at a moment when those most likely to contest the decision were otherwise occupied with a war. The physical artifacts of the previous tradition were modified or discarded. The knowledge embedded in them was not preserved. Within a generation, the standard they represented was not just replaced but forgotten, so thoroughly that most people alive today are unaware it ever existed. You have been listening to the replacement every day of your life. In every song that has moved you, in every concert hall, every pair of headphones, every car radio, every phone speaker. The entire sonic world you inhabit was calibrated, before you were born, to a number chosen by a Chicago instrument manufacturer in 1910 and ratified by a London conference in 1939. You were never consulted. The question was never put to you. The previous standard was gone before you arrived, and no one thought to mention it had existed. The fork in the Bologna archive still produces its sound, warm, full, physical, the sound of a standard that the world used for centuries and abandoned in a decade. Whether anything was lost when it was abandoned is a question the evidence does not conclusively answer, but it is a question that, once asked, is surprisingly difficult to put back down.